If you mistake restraint for weakness, you do not start a war. You erase the last thing standing between your children and the dark. No one could agree on who had first spoken those words. Some said it was an old Terran president. Others insisted it came from a forgotten admiral whose name had been buried beneath 3 centuries of classified records. By the time anyone cared enough to argue, the warning had already become history. For 300 years, Earth had been quiet. Not peaceful, quiet. There was a difference, though very few species still remembered it. Entire generations had grown up without seeing a Terran warship patrol the trade routes. Human colonies paid their taxes, honored every treaty, settled disputes through arbitration, and politely declined invitations to every major military alliance. Their diplomats arrived on time, smiled for the cameras, signed the paperwork, and went home. It became almost fashionable across the galaxy to joke that humanity had finally grown out of its violent past. The younger delegates laughed the hardest because they had never lived in a galaxy where Earth mattered. Inside the Grand Council chamber, surrounded by towering columns of polished black crystal that reflected the light of 1,000 distant suns, another meeting dragged toward its predictable conclusion. Representatives argued over tariffs, mining rights, shipping lanes, and border inspections while reporters filled the upper galleries, hoping someone important would lose their temper. Instead, they watched Councillor Nerix, one of the youngest senators ever elected to the chamber, lean back in his chair with an easy grin. "Let's be honest," he said, loud enough for every microphone to catch. "Humanity isn't dangerous anymore." A few delegates chuckled. Someone near the back applauded. Another lifted a glass in mock celebration. The cameras drifted toward the Terran delegation, expecting outrage, a rebuttal, maybe at least an offended expression. They found none. Ambassador Walter Hayes quietly adjusted his reading glasses, opened a weathered leather notebook that looked older than half the governments in the room, and wrote a single sentence with a fountain pen instead of a digital stylus. His assistant, Sarah Collins, glanced toward him. "Sir," she whispered. Walter closed the notebook without answering. His face betrayed nothing. At 68, with silver hair, tired blue eyes, and the calm posture of a man who had attended far too many meetings that changed the course of history, he looked more like a retired accountant than Earth's highest representative. Nerix noticed the silence and smiled even wider. "No response," he asked. "I suppose that proves my point." More laughter rolled across the chamber. Walter finally looked up, not at Nerix, but toward the enormous star map suspended above the council floor. Tiny lights marked every known civilization, every trade corridor, every colony connected by centuries of cooperation. His eyes lingered on the small blue marker labeled Soul. Sarah leaned closer. "Should we answer him?" she asked. Walter's voice was barely above a whisper. "No, they're insulting us on a live broadcast." "I know. People back home won't like this." Walter offered the faintest smile. "People back home stopped caring what this room thinks a very long time ago." The meeting continued as if nothing important had happened. Motions were introduced. Votes were counted. Reporters searched for another headline. Yet Walter never looked away from the map for very long. Something about the room felt wrong. Not dangerous. Familiar. It reminded him of old photographs taken just before hurricanes reached the shoreline, when the sky still looked clear and families were convinced they had one more quiet afternoon. As the council recessed for lunch, delegates filtered into the marble corridors, still laughing about humanity's long decline. Walter remained seated until the chamber was almost empty. Only then did he reopen his notebook and read the line he had written moments earlier. It contained just 6 words. "They finally forgot why we waited." Walter Hayes did not leave with the rest of the delegates. He waited until the chamber had emptied, listening to the fading footsteps echo through the enormous hall. 300 years ago, that silence would have meant something entirely different. Back then, silence came before fleets launched, before emergency broadcasts filled every frequency, before ordinary families hurried their children indoors because everyone knew the news was about to get worse. Now it simply meant lunch. Sarah Collins returned carrying 2 cups of coffee from the diplomatic cafe. She handed one to Walter without saying a word. He accepted it with a quiet smile. "Still the same order?" she asked. "Black. No sugar." He nodded. Some habits survive longer than governments. They walked slowly through the council's eastern corridor where enormous windows overlooked the central star of the capital system. Tourists filled the observation decks, taking pictures while school groups pointed excitedly at passing freighters crossing the bright sky. It looked peaceful. Walter remembered another sky, another generation, another day when people had believed peace would last forever. Sarah finally broke the silence. Did they really forget? Walter looked out the window before answering. Most of them were not born yet. Someone had to teach them. Someone tried. They reached a quiet balcony overlooking the city below. Hundreds of air lanes carried civilian traffic between glittering towers. Restaurants opened their terraces. Music drifted upward from public gardens. Everything felt comfortable. Safe. Sarah leaned against the railing. You have been coming here for almost 30 years. Have they always talked about us like that? Walter chuckled softly. Not at first. What changed? Time. He took another sip of coffee before continuing. People remember pain for a generation. Their children remember the stories. Their grandchildren remember the celebrations after it ended. By the fourth generation, they only remember that nothing bad has happened in a very long time. That is usually when someone decides history has become unnecessary. Sarah looked at him carefully. You were there, were you not? Walter did not answer immediately. His reflection stared back at him through the glass. Older now. Slower. But his eyes had not changed. I was a young communications officer during the last campaign. Sarah had heard rumors over the years. She knew Walter rarely spoke about his early life. Was it really as bad as the archives claim? Walter slowly shook his head. No. She looked surprised. It was worse. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, Sarah asked the question she had been carrying for years. Then why did Earth walk away? If humanity was strong enough to shape the galaxy, why spend 3 centuries pretending to be ordinary? Walter rested both hands on the cool stone railing. Because every victory came with a bill. He looked toward the horizon where countless ships crossed peaceful trade lanes. The day we won, millions of children across dozens of worlds woke up without parents. Entire economies collapsed. Species disappeared from history. We survived, but surviving is not always something to celebrate. Sarah quietly lowered her eyes. Walter continued in the same calm voice. So Earth made a promise. We would build instead of conquer. We would negotiate instead of threaten. We would never become addicted to winning. His communicator vibrated once against his wrist. The secure channel displayed a simple priority code from Earth. No emergency signal. No alarm. Just a request for confirmation. Walter read it once and locked the screen. Sarah noticed the change in his expression. Something happened? Walter slipped the communicator into his pocket. Not yet. Should I be worried? He looked back toward the council building where delegates were laughing through the open courtyard as though nothing in the universe could ever surprise them again. No, he said quietly. I am worried enough for everyone. The secure message waited until Walter and Sarah returned to the Terran diplomatic office, a modest suite tucked away beneath the towering embassies of far wealthier civilizations. There were no marble statues, no ceremonial guards, no grand displays of military victories. A bookshelf filled with paper volumes occupied one wall. A framed photograph of Earth from orbit hung behind Walter's desk. A faded American flag rested inside a simple glass case beside an old United Nations emblem that had survived more history than most planets. Sarah sealed the office door and activated the privacy field. Secure room confirmed, she said. Walter nodded once. Open the transmission. A familiar face appeared above the conference table. President Daniel Brooks looked older than he had during their last encrypted meeting. His dark suit was unbuttoned, his sleeves rolled halfway up his forearms, and a thick folder rested beside him instead of the usual digital display. That alone told Walter this conversation was serious. Good afternoon, Walter, Brooks said quietly. I wish this were a social call. Walter sat down without removing his jacket. What happened? The president slid a photograph across the table. It showed a lonely structure standing on a frozen moon beneath a pale blue sky. It looked ordinary, almost forgotten. Beacon 12, Walter whispered. Sarah studied the image. That is one of ours. Walter nodded. Older than the council itself. Brooks folded his hands. 3 hours ago, long-range surveillance confirmed that the Vascari Dominion has entered the system. Sarah frowned. Why would they want an abandoned station? Walter answered before the president could. Because they think it is abandoned. Brooks continued. Emperor Kaler believes the beacon contains navigation records from humanity's expansion era. His advisors estimate it may hold lost military technology worth billions of credits. Sarah looked confused. Does it? Walter slowly looked away from the image. No. Brooks gave a tired smile. Not even close. The room fell quiet. Finally, Sarah asked, then what is it really? Walter stared at the old photograph for several long seconds. A lock. Sarah blinked. A lock for what? Walter did not answer. Brooks spoke instead. That information remains classified above my clearance, yours, and nearly everyone else's. Only the Guardian Council has complete access. Sarah leaned back in disbelief. You are telling me the President of Earth does not know? Brooks shrugged with a humorless smile. There are some promises that outlive presidents. Another alert appeared on the table. A live news broadcast filled the room. Imperial ships bearing the crimson crest of the Vascari Dominion drifted into orbit around the frozen moon. Reporters excitedly described the operation as a lawful reclamation of abandoned human property beyond recognized Terran borders. Crowds gathered to watch. Analysts praised Emperor Kaler for expanding his influence without firing a single shot. Walter watched every second without changing expression. Sarah looked from the screen to him. They have no idea. No, Walter replied softly. They truly do not. Brooks leaned closer to the camera. The Guardian Council has already met. They unanimously recommend immediate evacuation of Beacon 12's automated systems before the Dominion lands. Walter closed his eyes. Too late. Brooks understood immediately. You think they are already inside? Walter nodded. Kaler built his reputation on moving faster than anyone expected. If the media knows where they are, then his advanced teams landed hours ago. Sarah looked toward the silent image of the frozen moon. Can we stop this? Walter stood and walked toward the window overlooking the council district where thousands of people continued enjoying another peaceful afternoon. We can ask. He paused before adding one final sentence. The question is whether anyone still remembers why humanity almost never asks twice. The request left Earth exactly 11 minutes later. No threats. No military escorts. No dramatic countdown. Just a single encrypted diplomatic packet routed through every legal council channel and addressed directly to Emperor Kaler of the Vascari Dominion. Walter insisted on writing every word himself. Sarah watched him type slowly, stopping now and then to think before adding another sentence. When he finished, she expected pages of legal arguments or historical evidence. Instead, the message contained only 34 words. President Brooks read it twice before looking back at Walter through the secure connection. That is all. Walter nodded. That is enough. Brooks sighed. I hope you are right. The transmission crossed the galaxy in less than 4 minutes. By then, Emperor Kaler was already standing inside the command center of Beacon 12. The station looked disappointingly ordinary. Narrow corridors, aging metal walls, manual control panels, dust resting on equipment that had not been touched in centuries. His senior advisor, Minister Vorin, scanned another section and laughed quietly. This is what frightened the old council. It is practically a museum. Kaler smiled. He was younger than most rulers, confident without appearing reckless, and proud of the empire he had built through careful expansion instead of endless wars. History always exaggerates its ghosts, he replied. One of his engineers approached, carrying an old metallic cylinder. Your Majesty, we have located the central archive. Kaler raised an eyebrow. Already. It was not hidden. Another officer added. Human security systems are almost non-existent. No active weapons. No defensive drones. No encryption beyond obsolete standards. Several officers exchanged amused looks. The legends surrounding humanity continued to shrink with every passing minute. Then the communications officer interrupted. Message from Earth, Your Majesty. Kaler accepted the transmission and projected it into the room. Walter Hayes appeared standing behind a plain wooden desk with the blue and white flag of Earth quietly displayed in the background. His expression remained calm. Emperor Kaler, Walter began. On behalf of the United Nations of Earth, I respectfully request that your personnel leave Beacon 12 immediately. Do not activate any system. Do not remove any equipment. Please withdraw your fleet and allow our recovery teams to secure the station. If you do this now, nothing else needs to happen. The recording ended. Silence filled the control room before laughter broke out among several officers. Voren folded his arms. He sounds almost apologetic. Another advisor smirked. I expected demands. We received a polite request. Kaler watched the message one more time. Something about Walter's face bothered him. There was no anger, no fear, only genuine concern. Run a complete structural scan, Kaler ordered. Again? Voren asked. Again. Minutes later, the chief engineer returned. No concealed weapons. No reactor instability. No hidden fleet signals. Nothing unusual. Kaler nodded slowly. Then proceed. Back inside the Terran embassy, Sarah lowered the audio feed. They are ignoring us. Walter simply reached for his coat hanging beside the office door. Yes. Should I contact President Brooks? He already knows. Sarah followed Walter into the hallway. Where are we going? Home. She stopped walking. Home. Walter looked back with the same tired smile she had seen so many times before. My work here is finished. Outside, the council district buzzed with afternoon traffic. Cafes remained crowded. Tourists filled the plazas. Reporters chased political gossip. Not one person noticed the elderly ambassador quietly walking toward the spaceport, carrying nothing except a worn leather notebook and a small overnight bag. While on a frozen moon far beyond the frontier, the first human seal that had remained untouched for 300 years waited for someone who no longer believed old warnings mattered. Walter Hayes arrived over Earth 18 hours later. The shuttle descended through gray morning clouds before touching down at Andrews Space Force Base just outside Washington, District of Columbia. There was no welcoming ceremony waiting on the runway. No military band. No television cameras. Only 2 black utility vehicles and a woman in a Navy business suit holding a plain visitor badge. Welcome home, Ambassador, she said. Walter smiled faintly. It has been too long, Emily. Emily Carter had worked in the executive office for almost 20 years. She had once been a legal intern. Now she coordinated meetings that officially did not exist. As the vehicles rolled away from the base, Sarah looked out the window at familiar highways crowded with commuters heading toward another ordinary workday. Parents dropped children off at school. Coffee shops were already full. Joggers crossed neighborhood parks without realizing the most important meeting in 3 centuries was beginning less than 10 miles away. Does anyone know? Sarah asked quietly. Walter looked toward the city skyline. Very few. Should they? Walter thought for a moment before answering. No family deserves to spend breakfast wondering whether history is about to repeat itself. 30 minutes later, the convoy disappeared beneath an unmarked government building. The elevators descended far deeper than Sarah expected. 50 feet became 100, then 200. Finally, the doors opened into a circular chamber carved directly into solid bedrock. The room was surprisingly simple. A round oak table stood beneath soft lighting. There were no holographic displays covering the walls. No dramatic command center. Only 12 empty chairs and an American flag standing beside the blue flag of Earth. President Daniel Brooks stood as Walter entered. The 2 men shook hands without speaking. Around the table sat engineers, historians, scientists, military officers, and constitutional scholars. Gray hair outnumbered dark hair by nearly 3 to 1. These were people chosen not because they wanted power, but because they had spent decades refusing to misuse it. Sarah quietly took her seat near the back of the room. Brooks opened the meeting with a single sentence. Beacon 12 has been breached. Nobody gasped. Nobody panicked. Several people simply closed their eyes. Dr. Rebecca Morgan, the oldest historian in the room, removed a worn leather binder from her briefcase. Then it is time to review the original covenant. She placed the binder on the table. The cover carried no classification markings, only a handwritten date from exactly 300 years earlier. Sarah glanced toward Walter. You signed that? Walter nodded once. All of us did. General Marcus Donovan folded his arms. For 3 centuries, every administration honored the agreement without exception. We reduced our fleet. We sealed our research divisions. We dismantled entire weapons programs. Every president accepted the same burden. Sarah frowned. Why would humanity willingly give up that much? Dr. Morgan answered gently. Because there is a difference between possessing power and deserving to use it. Brooks looked around the table. The Dominion believes they have discovered forgotten technology. Walter slowly shook his head. They found something much more dangerous. Sarah leaned forward. Then tell me what Beacon 12 protects. The room became completely silent. Walter rested one hand on the old binder before speaking. It does not protect Earth. Sarah blinked in confusion. Then who does it protect? Walter looked directly into her eyes. Everyone else. No one argued with him. No one smiled. Outside the hidden facility, another peaceful morning continued across the country, while beneath the ground, 12 people quietly accepted the same impossible responsibility that had been passed from one generation to the next, hoping they were not already 300 years too late. Far above the frozen moon, Emperor Kaler watched another progress report appear across the bridge display. Every section of Beacon 12 had now been mapped. Every storage room cataloged. Every power conduit traced from end to end. The station continued to behave exactly like an abandoned human outpost. Minister Vorin folded his hands with obvious satisfaction. Your Majesty, I believe the Terrans overestimated the importance of this place. We have found maintenance logs, obsolete engineering manuals, and enough dust to fill a warehouse. Nothing more. Kaler remained quiet. He had built an empire by distrusting easy victories. And the central chamber? He asked. The chief engineer nodded. We located it 1 hour ago. It is sealed behind an old mechanical door. No electronic lock. No energy shield. Just a physical release mechanism. Several officers exchanged amused glances. One of them laughed softly. The humans protected their greatest secret with a handle. Kayla did not laugh. Open it carefully. The engineering team acknowledged the order. Thousands of miles away beneath the Appalachian Mountains, a red indicator illuminated on the round table inside the Guardian chamber. Nobody spoke. Sarah watched the single light blinking in complete silence. What does that signal mean? She asked. Dr. Rebecca Morgan answered before Walter could. The final seal has been reached. Sarah looked around the room. Can we stop them remotely? General Marcus Donovan slowly shook his head. Not anymore. President Brooks rested both hands on the oak table. Walter, if there is another warning we can send, this is the moment. Walter stared at the blinking light for several long seconds before pulling a folded sheet of paper from inside his notebook. Unlike every classified document Sarah had seen since arriving, this page was handwritten. The ink had faded with age. This message was prepared 300 years ago, Walter said quietly. Sarah looked stunned. 300. Walter nodded. The authors believed one day someone would ignore the first warning. They asked us to deliver this one only if the final seal was reached. Brooks gave a silent nod. Walter activated the secure transmitter. Moments later, the recording appeared before Emperor Kaler. This time there was no ambassador sitting behind a desk. Instead, an elderly woman with white hair looked directly into the camera. Her voice carried the calm confidence of someone speaking from experience rather than fear. If you are watching this, then our first request was ignored. My name is Dr. Eleanor Grant. I helped build the Covenant after the last Great War. Whatever you believe this station contains, you are mistaken. There are no weapons here worth stealing. No fortune worth claiming. Close the door. Leave this place. Go home. History will never remember your restraint, but billions of innocent lives will continue because of it. The recording ended. Silence settled across the bridge. Vorin shook his head with a smile. Remarkable. They prepared ghost stories for future generations. Another officer chuckled. Old humans always did enjoy dramatic speeches. Kaler looked toward the image of the sealed chamber displayed on the main screen. Something still felt wrong. Not because he believed the warning, but because every human who had spoken to him sounded genuinely concerned for everyone except themselves. Before he could speak, the engineering chief interrupted. Your Majesty, the release mechanism has disengaged. Kaler slowly stood from his command chair. Proceed. Back on Earth, the blinking red light changed without making a sound. It became steady. Walter quietly closed his eyes. Sarah whispered the question nobody else wanted to ask. Was that the last warning? Walter opened his eyes again, his voice almost too soft to hear. No, that was the last chance. The first report sounded almost ridiculous. A navigation relay near the edge of civilized space briefly disappeared from every telescope before returning exactly 3 seconds later. Engineers blamed a software fault. Then another relay vanished. Then an observation platform orbiting a distant red giant reported that every star within its field of view had faded at the exact same instant before slowly returning. Astronomers across the galaxy argued over faulty sensors, while emergency maintenance crews recalibrated equipment that had never failed before. Inside Beacon 12, Kaler stood in the open doorway of the central chamber. The room beyond was surprisingly small. There were no hidden weapons, no vaults overflowing with forgotten technology, no impossible machines humming with ancient power. At the center stood a simple stone pedestal supporting a metal sphere no larger than a basketball. Thin lines of pale blue light moved slowly across its surface like gentle waves. The engineers scanned it repeatedly. No detectable energy output, one reported. No radiation. No transmission signals. No active defense systems. Vorin smiled. This is what terrified them. Kaler stepped closer. An inscription had been carved into the pedestal in dozens of languages. The human text appeared first. He read it aloud. The watch ends only when another accepts it. He frowned. That hardly explains anything. One of the technicians carefully lifted the sphere from its cradle. Nothing happened. No alarms. No explosions. The room remained perfectly quiet. Several officers relaxed immediately. It really was just an old monument, someone muttered. At almost the exact same moment, every screen inside the Guardian chamber beneath the Appalachian Mountains turned black. Sarah instinctively looked around the room. Did we lose power? General Donovan slowly stood. No. 1 second later, every display returned by itself. Instead of maps and communications, a single message filled every monitor. Covenant status. Watch concluded. Sarah stared at the words. What does that mean? Walter answered without looking away from the screen. It means the system believes nobody is standing watch anymore. President Brooks quietly inhaled. Can it be restarted? Dr. Morgan slowly shook her head. Not from here. Across the galaxy, observatories began flooding the council with identical reports. Entire sectors were experiencing brief periods where stars vanished from every sensor before returning moments later. Cargo pilots requested emergency guidance after automated navigation systems temporarily lost stellar reference points. Long-range communications suffered strange delays. Scientists rushed to explain the phenomenon, each theory collapsing within minutes as new data arrived. The Council declared a Level 3 scientific emergency. News networks interrupted regular programming. Commentators insisted the disturbances were unrelated and temporary, yet their voices carried growing uncertainty. Emperor Kaler watched similar reports arriving on his own bridge. Vorin dismissed them with a wave of his hand. Coincidences happened during every major expedition. Kaler did not respond. He turned back toward the empty pedestal. The room suddenly felt different. Not dangerous. Lonely. As though something that had quietly performed its duty for centuries had simply stepped away without complaint. He looked at the metal sphere resting inside the technician's containment case. Return it, Kaler said. The engineer hesitated. Your Majesty? Put it back. The technician obeyed immediately, placing the sphere exactly where it had rested before. Nothing changed. No blue light returned beneath the pedestal. No hidden mechanism awakened. Only silence answered. Far beneath Earth, Walter closed the old leather notebook he had carried for most of his life. Sarah noticed his hands trembling for the first time. Can they still fix this? She asked. Walter looked toward the darkened monitors before quietly replying. They are trying to repair a lighthouse after they convinced the keeper to leave. The problem is not the lighthouse anymore. The problem is that something out there has finally noticed the light is gone. Within 6 hours, the unexplained disturbances had spread across every major civilization. Commercial flights were delayed because automated star charts refused to agree with one another. Research observatories began comparing notes and reached the same impossible conclusion. The stars themselves had not disappeared. Something was preventing them from being seen. The phenomenon ignored distance, technology, and political borders as though the entire galaxy had suddenly been wrapped in an invisible curtain. Emergency sessions reopened inside the Grand Council chamber. The same senators who had laughed at humanity the day before now spoke over one another, demanding answers from every scientific academy they could contact. Councillor Nerix looked exhausted. There has to be a natural explanation, he insisted. There always is. No one sounded convinced anymore. Then every communication display inside the chamber flickered. The council seal vanished. A plain blue background replaced it. Walter Hayes appeared on every screen at the same moment. He was no longer speaking from the Terran embassy. Behind him stood only a simple wooden wall bearing the flag of Earth. He looked exactly as calm as he had during every meeting before, but this time nobody interrupted him. Representatives of the council, Walter began quietly. You have spent the last 300 years believing humanity withdrew because it had grown weaker. That was never true. The chamber fell completely silent. Walter continued. We stepped back because victory taught us something that defeat never could. Some responsibilities become too dangerous to celebrate. So we accepted one that nobody else even knew existed. Emperor Kaler watched the broadcast from his flagship without taking his eyes off the screen. Walter did not accuse him. He did not threaten retaliation. He simply spoke like a tired man, explaining an old mistake to people who had finally become willing to listen. Beacon 12 was never a military installation. It was one station in a network built after the last Great War. The network was not designed to imprison civilizations. It was designed to conceal this galaxy from something beyond it. Every beacon contributed to a signal that kept our corner of the universe hidden. For 3 centuries, humanity maintained that system in silence because the alternative was unacceptable. Murmurs spread through the council chamber. Several delegates looked genuinely confused. Others appeared frightened for the first time in decades. Walter slowly folded his hands. When your personnel removed the watch sphere, the network concluded that its guardians had abandoned their posts. It shut itself down exactly as it was designed to do. Kaler immediately turned toward his engineering staff. Can the system be restored? The chief engineer answered without hesitation. We have attempted every procedure available. The device no longer responds. Walter seemed almost to hear the question despite being light years away. You cannot restart it from Beacon 12 because the network does not recognize ownership. It recognizes responsibility. Sarah Collins stood just beyond the camera, watching the faces of countless alien leaders change from skepticism to uneasy understanding. Walter took one slow breath before speaking again. You believed Earth was hiding weapons. We were hiding a promise. We asked for nothing in return except that no one interfere. You honored that promise for 3 centuries without realizing it. Yesterday, that changed. The transmission ended without dramatic music, without demands, and without conditions. Across the galaxy, no one spoke for several long seconds. Finally, Counselor Nerix lowered his head and whispered words that every microphone accidentally captured. We were laughing at the people who had been protecting us the entire time. The apology reached Earth before the rescue fleets did. It came from Emperor Kaler himself, transmitted across every open frequency without advisors rewriting a single word. He stood alone on the bridge of his flagship, his uniform untouched by medals or ceremony. Ambassador Walter Hayes, he said quietly, I believed your silence meant fear. I believed your restraint meant decline. I was wrong. If there is still a way to repair what I have broken, the Vascari Dominion will follow your instructions. Walter listened without changing expression. When the transmission ended, Sarah looked toward him. Will you answer? Walter nodded. Yes. Will you forgive him? Walter looked out through the reinforced glass toward the blue curve of Earth. Forgiveness has never been the difficult part. An hour later, the largest civilian convoy in recorded history departed from Seoul. There were Terran engineers, scientists, historians, and volunteers. Behind them came ships from governments that only yesterday had mocked humanity. Nobody argued over flags. Nobody negotiated trade rights. For the first time in centuries, every civilization understood that survival was not something any species could own by itself. Weeks passed before the first sections of the ancient network began responding again. One beacon after another accepted new caretakers. Not rulers. Not conquerors. Caretakers. Humanity no longer stood alone. Every participating world accepted a single responsibility that could never again become the burden of one civilization. Beacon 12 remained exactly where it had always been, but beside the human emblem now stood dozens of others, each placed there by a people who finally understood why the station had never needed soldiers. It had needed patience. Months later, the Grand Council gathered once again beneath the same crystal ceiling where laughter had once echoed so easily. Counselor Nerix requested permission to speak before the official session began. He walked to the center of the chamber and looked directly toward Walter Hayes. 300 years ago, he said, your people chose responsibility over recognition. Yesterday, we confused humility with weakness. Today, this council records that mistake, so no generation will ever forget it. No applause followed. Respect did not need applause. Walter rose from his seat one final time as Earth's ambassador. He was retiring after nearly 4 decades of service. Sarah walked beside him toward the chamber doors. "Do you think they will remember this time?" she asked. Walter smiled the same quiet smile she had seen on the day everything began. For a while. And after that, he paused before stepping into the corridor. Then someone else will have to remind them. Years later, children across dozens of worlds would learn a simple lesson in school. It was not about the greatest fleet or the strongest weapon. It was about an old ambassador with a worn leather notebook who kept asking strangers to leave one forgotten place alone. Most of those children would never know his name. They would only remember the lesson written beneath every restored beacon across the galaxy. Strength is measured by what you could do. Wisdom is measured by what you choose not to do. And the greatest guardians in history are often the ones no one notices until they quietly stop standing watch.